to be yawning at you.
All right. Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is the second Friday night Bible study in July, so it is Friday, July 12th. Now, last week, as we were starting, I mentioned that there was a tropical storm approaching Texas. I had seen news about it, and I had thought it was going to hit a little bit sooner. The storm didn't actually get to Texas until Monday of this week. And I just saw a story saying that there are still lots of customers without electricity in the Houston area. Now, I do recall in November of 2017, um, this would have been a few months after all the flooding. I forget the name of the storm now, but there was a storm that came ashore, and it wasn't a particular big problem with winds, but it was a very, very serious problem with flooding because of all the rain. And in November, I think the storm, as I recall, came through sometime in August. In September, November, when we were there, we still saw abandoned boats in the median of the interstate uh, around the Bush International Airport, or even north of that. So there were still effects to be seen of that storm. Well, the reason I'm mentioning that is because it did come ashore sometime Monday morning, and it did cause a lot of problems in Texas. But the storm also blew over where we live. And Monday night sometime, we got a notice that there was a tornado warning. We already knew there was a watch for our area, but there was a tornado warning for our specific area. And so we tuned in to a local TV station's weather feed. Uh, we don't have antenna to pick up TV by antenna, but you can. A lot of these stations will stream things like that, so we picked that up. And I haven't heard. They believed at the time that this storm and the part that was being looked at had produced a tornado that touched down just south of our county. And they actually, before we quit watching when the threat was passed, they actually had pictures some people in that area had taken of a building with a metal roof that had gotten pretty much wiped out by whatever came through. And that's what made them believe it probably was a tornado that touched down. Now, this being part of a tropical storm, one of the features they pointed out about these tropical storms is that when they generate tornadoes, the tornadoes rarely touch down for very long. They kind of come down and then come right back up. So there's a very small area of damage caused by any particular tornado because they tend not to stay down for very long. Um, when we first tuned in and they were tracking this storm, it looked like it was headed straight for our city. But as the night progressed, and we're talking a period of about an hour here, it began to veer a little bit to the west of us, and eventually they were discussing a threat to a larger city about 20 miles west of us. But as it got closer, uh, as it went farther north, it became less and less of a threat, and the meteorologists who were watching the data from radar and other sources as this storm moved through saw it as less and less likely to produce a tornado touchdown. So we were prepared to go hide in our walk-in shower. Probably it's got stone tile walls, so that gives it a level of sturdiness. Plus, it's inside, away from windows, and so that's what we believe is probably the best place for us to go in case of a tornado in our house. We have a one-story house, so that's about the best we can do. I did mention last week Hurricane Camille. I didn't say where I was. I was actually about 100 miles inland, and I was at a boarding school, and we were there for the summer. I was part of the summer work crew. We would pick peaches and pick okra and pick gladiolas. The school grew gladiolas in the summer, and the farm director would sell them, and apparently brought in quite a bit of revenue in that way. So there were always things around for us to do. At that particular point, they were having a staff change before that fall at both dormitories, both the boys' dormitory, the boys' dean. Our dean the first year had been a former professional softball player who also taught PE. And he was a large man, but he was pretty well liked by the men, and he was the dean of men. He was single, and he had a dune buggy. And the dean of women was a divorced woman with 2 sons. And some of you may even have heard of one of her sons. Her name was Carol Darmody. And one of her sons, her younger son, was Steve. And if you've heard of Steve Darmody, he's a gospel recording artist that actually lives in our state. But so maybe you've heard of him. He was still in grade school back then. At any rate, his mother was moving on, so they were getting a new dean of women and a new dean of men. The new dean of women had appeared on campus and was supervising the young ladies who were staying on campus as part of the summer work crew. We young men were more or less self-supervised. There were some older students who had served as resident advisors who were kind of overseeing things. And the rules in those days at that school were that the students weren't allowed to have radios. Well, some of the guys had them anyway, and so they had tuned in that night because we knew the storm was coming. And I was about the only one that had a room on the first floor of the dorm. The rest of them all were up on the second floor. Well, the middle of the night, I'm sound asleep, they come down, wake me up, and tell me that I need to get off the first floor. Their concern was flooding, apparently, so they believed it would be safer to be on the second floor. So we went up to the second floor, listened to the radio. I was awake some and asleep some as the storm blew across campus. We did okay. I mean, there wasn't any flooding. We didn't really need to be on the second floor, but we were. However, over at the girls' dorm, the new dean of girls, also being aware of the storm, called the girls down to the first floor and had them staying at a room somewhere on the first floor, possibly even in her apartment. I don't remember. The interesting thing was that there were a few tornadoes spawned by that hurricane, and one of them, I believe, based on what I saw, came across the campus because there was a very distinct path of heavy damage across the auto mechanics building, some of the classrooms, and then it crossed over the campus, and it missed the boys' dormitory, but it did hit the girls' dormitory, and it actually ripped the roof off part of the girls' dormitory. So in the following days after the storm blew through, when there was still a lot of rain and we were having to go through and squeegee the water off the top floor of the girls' dormitory, because the roof had been ripped off and the water was just pouring down in onto the second floor. And one of the bathrooms was totally open. The roof was just gone there, and you could just sit there on the, if anybody had been using them, you could have sat on one of the commodes and looked at the stars at night. The roof was clear gone there, so they had to get that fixed in short order. School was scheduled to start a week after the storm blew through. Because of the storm, they delayed the start of school by a week. I remember the storm came through, I think it was on a Monday night, and that Friday evening, they actually had power starting to come back on. We had been without power until then. The other thing I remember about that is that the next morning we were out walking around on campus looking at the damage, and I managed to step on an exposed nail. So I had to go to a darkened doctor's office to get a tetanus shot because I'd stepped on a rusty nail, and they wanted to make sure. And there wasn't any power, so the doctor didn't have any power. I was in a darkened office, but the doctor was able to give me the tetanus shot. So that was kind of the event of the week for us, having that storm blow across. And we did get a lot of rain, and there was a threat of flooding in our area. We usually don't worry about it at our house because we're kind of half to 2/3 of the way up a hill, so the creek that goes through is about a block away from our house, maybe just a little over that, and is quite a bit lower than our house. We do have flooding issues because they put the garage on this property down below street level, so the driveway from the street to the garage is all downhill, and so rain hits the street in our driveway and runs down, wants to run into the garage. And what we've had to do is, when I was working, they would throw pallets into the trash, and I would go grab pallets out of the trash and stick them in my trunk and bring them home. So the stuff that could be water damage in our garage, we put up on pallets so that if the water, comes through, it's rarely even an inch deep in there. It's protected, it doesn't get wet. You still there? Or did you go to sleep on me?
I'm here. I'm thinking something. You occasionally mention during Hurricane Camille that there are pictures of Adventist pastors drinking from Budweiser cans.
I mentioned that last week, yes.
Yeah, and you say that it's full of water. But I have a theory on that. Adventist pastors aren't supposed to be drinking beer.
Well, yeah.
And, it could be that rather than beer, that was just fermented peaches in those cans.
There's a story behind that bit about fermented peaches. You want to tell it?
No, it's not my story. I wouldn't dare tell that.
Well, a number of years after that, I was going to school in Colorado. And the place where I was living had gotten in a load of peaches, and we had spent the week canning peaches, and we were canning them in 2-quart wide mouth canning jars. And when you do home canning like that, occasionally it happens that one of the jars doesn't seal properly, where you can set it aside and keep it for later. So when we got done with a batch, and we had a jar or two that hadn't sealed properly, well, the lady of the house set it aside in the refrigerator, and so for a meal Saturday, they were tied up at the nursing home, sanitarium, doing their duty that week. So both the lady and her husband were tied up. So she gave me instructions on how to fix lunch for everybody that lived there. And part of her instructions included going to the refrigerator and getting out those unsealed jars of peaches and serving them up as part of our lunch. So I did that, and everybody showed up for lunch, and I used to really love peaches, particularly frozen peaches. These weren't frozen, but I like peaches, so I had served myself up a pretty sizable helping of peaches and set into them, and somebody else started on their peaches, and they expressed doubt about them, and some other people tried it. They also said, "Nah, this doesn't taste right." Well, meanwhile, I finished my big helping of peaches. Well, apparently, even though they were in the fridge, these peaches had fermented. And so what I got was a sizable helping of probably low percent alcohol. So I ended up being sort of drunk. Um, After lunch, after things got cleaned up, I was going to go out for a walk. So I went to the room where my bed was, sat down on the bed to change my shoes. And when I sat down on the bed, it kind of felt nice. I thought, yeah, I think I'll take a nap. Now, this was probably by then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I lay down to take a nap, and when I woke up, it was 9 o'clock at night. I slept straight through for 6 hours without being aware of anything as a result of that. So that's why my wife made that comment about fermented peaches in those cans. Why'd we do that?
Oh, we do things like that.
Okay, well, anyway. I think we probably ought to go ahead.
We like to chit chat.
Yeah. I think we probably ought to go ahead and get started. So let's bow our heads and we'll get into our Bible study for this evening. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the blessings that you give to us. We thank you for the protection that you have provided to people, and that even those who suffered through this storm have survived, and some of them are getting their power back. And we just thank you that you do put limits on the destroyer and on his attempts to wipe out the human race. We thank you for your character of love. And as we open the written word this evening to catch a glimpse of that character, we ask that the Holy Spirit will come and enlighten us and enlighten each individual in the way that you know that individual needs a particular bit of information or help at this time. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I would like, before we actually begin reading, to address something that we talked about last week and didn't really get into, and there was an element of that I wanted to address. We read the account of the plague on the firstborn, and we read that there was a destroyer that came through to kill the firstborn. And we identified that destroyer as the individual who's called Apollyon, Greek for destroyer, or Abaddon, Hebrew for destroyer, in the book of Revelation. And while the King James and other versions just say destroyer, the version that we've been reading from here, the New Living Translation, actually called it death angel. And a lot of us, when we were raised on these stories, were told about the destroying angel. And we identified an individual who is an angel, was once a covering cherub, and who has become the author of evil in an otherwise perfect universe. Now, here's a question you might imagine. These plagues, and particularly the last plagues, served to set God's people free from their bondage in Israel, providing God with the metaphor of liberation that he wanted to have through his chosen people. Why would Satan do something that would end up serving God's plans and interests? What would you think that answer is? Renee?
I guess the easiest way to say it would be to ask, where's the best place to hide something?
Well, okay. But there was a different point I was wanting to make about that.
Well, I'm gonna finish if you'll let me.
Okay, go ahead.
Satan's agenda is to place upon God his own evil characteristics rather than let people know about God's pure and good and holy characteristics,
Okay.
which leads you to fear God. And you serve him out of fear, which is the wrong motive.
So essentially,
God.
what every time I start to talk, you start to talk, and so my phone shuts off because it hears me talking, and so I don't hear you. Go ahead and finish what you're going to say.
I said I forgot your question.
Well, we're talking about how the destroyer did all these acts of destruction in Egypt, and those acts served to set the people of Israel free from their bondage in Egypt and to give God the metaphor of liberation that he wanted. Why would Satan do something like that would serve God's interest? Now, you were suggesting that he did it in order to reflect badly on God's character.
Yeah.
Might I also suggest that he can't help it? It is his character to destroy. He is the destroyer because that's who he became when he separated himself from God and began to misrepresent God's character. So
He
now,
destroyed his own character.
yeah. So now, even though it might be in his interest not to destroy in certain situations, it's his nature to do so, so he does so anyway. Some time ago we told us,
and it got put down in the record books that God is the one that did it.
Well, because that was the mindset of the Hebrew people. And perhaps, like you say, he wanted to misrepresent the character of God, so he acted to try and get it in the record that God did all these things when, in fact, he is the destroyer that went through Egypt and killed all the firstborn. When God made way for him to do that. You remember the story of the scorpion and the frog?
Yeah.
For those of you who may not know it, a scorpion comes to a river, and the scorpion couldn't swim, but it wanted to cross the river. And it came across the frog, and it asked the frog to take it across the river. And the frog says, "No, you'll sting me, and I'll die." And the scorpion said, "Well, if I'm on your back and you're swimming through the river, if I sting you and you die, I'll drown." So the frog thought about it and decided, well, okay. So he lets the scorpion climb on his back, and they start to cross the river. And about midstream, the scorpion stings the frog. And as he's dying, the frog asks, "Why did you do that? Now we're both going to die." And the scorpion answered, "It's my nature." So in that case, even though it cost the scorpion his life, he did what he did because it was his nature. And so in this situation where God is arranging things to have a metaphor of liberation at the outset of the history of his chosen people, illustrating for us that at the outset of our spiritual journey, we also, through God, can have a liberation event, liberating ourselves from the bondage of sin. Satan did these things even though it ultimately wasn't in his interest to do so, because it was his nature. He couldn't help himself. I recently have seen
He was created with the good and perfect nature, but he managed to destroy it.
Well, yeah, entirely on his own, without outside influence, without any abuse heaped on him to generate these problems, as is the case with most of us. Most of us are trapped in sin because we were abused when we were younger, in some way or another, by our parents or by the people around us, and this has led to the problems that we need to be liberated from. He didn't have that, but still, he went bad. At any rate, I guess let's move on forward here. Exodus chapter 14, and let's switch to this so you can see what we're reading. And here it says, "Then the Lord gave these instructions to Moses. Order the Israelites to turn back and camp by Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. Camp there along the shore across from Baal-zephon. Then Pharaoh will think, the Israelites are confused. They are trapped in the wilderness. And once again I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after you." Or footnote A will say that in the Hebrew it is, he will chase after them, that is, the Israelites. "I have planned this in order to display my glory through Pharaoh and his whole army. After this, the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh, or the Lord in all caps there. So the Israelites camped there as they were told. Now, I'm going to show you something here in just a little bit about where I think this was and how I think, now, granted, some of this information I encountered from a very unreliable source, but when you see what I show you, maybe you'll see why I think it may be the case anyway. When word reached the king of Egypt that the Israelites had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds. What have we done letting all those Israelite slaves get away? They asked. So Pharaoh harnessed his chariot and called up his troops. He took with him 600 of Egypt's best chariots, along with the rest of the chariots of Egypt, each with its commander. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so he chased after the people of Israel, who had left with fists raised in defiance. And the last 2 weeks we've talked about that, about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. God did not take away Pharaoh's freedom to choose. God hardened his heart in the sense that he brought Pharaoh to a decision point and then left him free to make up his own mind. And when he hardened his heart, when he changed his mind and said, wait a minute, I'm going to be a harsh and hard taskmaster, when he did that, it was his free choice, but it could be said that the Lord did it because he brought Pharaoh to this decision point. And so now it says here that the Lord instructed Moses, and this could well have been already, since we've already read about the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, which led the Israelites, and this was how the instructions were given, that instead of taking them directly where they thought they were going to go, God led them in a different direction. And he said to Moses that this is going to make Pharaoh think they're lost in the desert, and he's going to come after them. And so now we're reading this about that. The Egyptians chased after them with all the forces in Pharaoh's army, all his horses and chariots, his charioteers, and his troops. So big show of military might and force. The Egyptians caught up with the people of Israel as they were camped beside the shore near Pi-hahiroth, across from Baal-zephon. Now, we've run across a number of names here, and I did a little research on these, because it says here Pi-hahiroth is between Migdol and the sea, and then across from Baal-zephon. So I looked all these places up. It says nothing about the Bible dictionary that I have here says nothing about the location of Pi-hahiroth or of Migdol, and its mention of the location of Baal-zephon indicates that the actual location is highly uncertain. Now, part of that may simply be that tradition has placed the crossing of the Red Sea on the Gulf of Suez rather than on the other Gulf of the northern end of the Red Sea. And I'm going to show you here in a moment why I think it might have been not the Gulf of Suez, but the other Gulf, I forget the name of it right now, where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, as the Hebrew puts it. So, verse 9, we were reading here, the Egyptians caught up with the people of Israel as they were camped beside the shore near Pi-hahiroth, across from Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord, and pay attention to these words because you're going to hear them quite a bit coming as we go forward. Why, they said to Moses, why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness. Human nature again. Better the misery you know than the uncertainty of something you don't know and the fear of the unknown. And what we're seeing here is fear of the unknown, fear of what looks to them to be obvious. The Egyptians are bearing down on them. But Moses told the people, don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will charge in after the Israelites. My great glory will be displayed through Pharaoh and his troops, his chariots and his charioteers. When my glory is displayed through them, all Egypt will see my glory and know that I am Yahweh. Then the angel of God, who had been leading the people of Israel, moved to the rear of the camp. The pillar of cloud also moved from the front and stood behind them. The cloud settled between the Egyptian and Israelite camps. As darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and Israelites did not approach each other all night. Now I'm curious because I seem to recall reading, and I'm going to look at another version here. And maybe it is later, that there's a description that they were trapped between the sea and the mountains.
That may be an Ellen thing.
Well, it might be. However, I'm looking through the Song of Moses and Miriam here to see if maybe it is mentioned there. No, I don't see it there. But at any rate, at this point, I want to call up Google Earth, and you can see here, if I zoom out a little bit, you can see the Nile Delta here, the fertile portion of Egypt, with Alexandria over here, Port Said over here. Here's the Gulf of Suez, and the other Gulf is the Gulf of Aqaba. Let's see if I zoom in if it'll actually say that. Yeah, Gulf of Aqaba. You probably can't read it, but that's what that says there. And then you can see the city of Aqaba up here near the north tip of that. However, if you zoom in down here, there are a couple of places like this. One of them is here, and you can see that there's a channel or a canyon in the mountains leading out to an open area at the edge of the Red Sea, or of the Gulf of Aqaba here. There's this one, and then there's this one down here. Now, since I first started watching these, the Egyptians have actually built things on these essentially beaches here, sand plains adjoining the sea. But as you can see here, if you've got the Egyptian army coming down this canyon where the people can't go back, and you've got mountains here and mountains up here and the sea here, the people might very much feel trapped between, the devil and the deep blue sea, so to speak. And that is one of the reasons why I think the crossing of the Red Sea may have taken place somewhere around here rather than, as is traditionally held, somewhere over here on the Gulf of Suez. And of course then if they cross that, then the mountain of God might be somewhere down here in what we today call Saudi Arabia, rather than on Mount Sinai. And let's see if I can find that. Mount Catherine, St. Catherine's Monastery, but I'm thinking that what we call Mount Sinai might be up here in this area. Why don't I do a quick search here? Okay, well they got the St. Catherine Monastery down here, and then they've got Mount Moses, Sinai, in this area. That is what we traditionally think of as Mount Sinai. The problem is, where is there a plain near there where you could have 1 to 1.5 million people along with their herds? Which leads me to doubt if that was really the place where that took place, rather than somewhere out here in the Arabian Peninsula. Not saying that's absolutely for certain what it is, just that that's a possibility. And when you look at these places that I just showed you here, you can imagine a situation where you would have a crowd of people out here on this beach, and the Egyptians are coming, and they are all of a sudden very much frightened. My phone just hung up, so maybe my wife went to sleep. She'll call me back if that wasn't the case. So we had started at verse 15, and we'd read that actually through 18. And then we read 19 and 20, how the Egyptians and the Israelite did not approach each other all night. So now let's move on to verse 21 here. Then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground with walls of water on each side. Then the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and charioteers, chased them into the middle of the sea. But just before dawn, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. "Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites," the Egyptians shouted. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Now, twisted there, footnote is, as in the Greek version, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Syriac version, that's what they've rendered, the twisted. The Hebrew reads, he removed, making it sound like maybe their wheels were falling off. At any rate, they were having trouble with their chariots. Well, stop and think about it. You know, you create dry land in the middle of the ocean. How dry is it really going to be? Might it not be sandy, boggy, and mushy because of all the silt that's been flowing into that part of the sea over the years? So now it's turned into dry land, but it's probably not completely dry. And while people could walk over it, and maybe even the flocks could get across it without a lot of trouble, these chariot wheels might not do so well because they're designed for cruising across dry land and sand. So they get down into this boggy muck at the bottom of the sea, and you might indeed have a little trouble getting the horses to be able to pull your chariots through all that muck and mush. And so then they'd have trouble. When all the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, "Raise your hand over the sea again. Then the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers." So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers, the entire army of Pharaoh. Of all the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea, not a single one survived. And again, I want to look at a different version just to see here how that went. Yes. Something interesting about that, in the song we played a few weeks back, it talked about, with the rod of God, part the waters of the sea. Well, it doesn't say that he used his staff here. It says, hold out your hand over the sea. Although I think you'll find that it's often rendered in artwork that Moses did in fact use his hand with his staff in it out over the sea, but it's not what the text says anyway. Now, did God do this in order to kill a bunch of Israelites? I mean a bunch of Egyptians. Or, here's an idea, God prepared a way of escape for his people. Only for his people. And it was quite clearly a superhuman act. I say superhuman, not supernatural. How God pulled it off, the physics of it, I'm not going to speculate. But it was something unusual that wasn't an everyday event. And it was obvious to the Egyptians that God, Yahweh, was at work to deliver his people here. So now, once again, Pharaoh faces a decision. These people have just risked their lives to cross below sea level through the sea on dry ground, relatively dry ground. But this is not the usual order of events. How likely is it that that unusual state of events, condition of nature in front of you, is going to continue long enough for you to get through behind them? So now Pharaoh is faced with this decision. Well, like Satan, like a lot of people trapped in sin, it's his nature. He's stubbornly insisted on trying to recapture these Israelite slaves, and he gets to this point, and he may be operating in a condition where evolution has shut down his rational brain, so now he's acting purely from his limbic emotional brain. That's making the decisions for him. So he's not thinking, he's not paying attention. It's like people who run from the police. In our state, you run from the police, they don't care how fast you're going. They'll do a tactical vehicle intervention, push your car off the road. It'll roll, it'll crash, it'll do all sorts of things. And the police don't particularly care. People have died in our state through tactical vehicle interventions done by the police in our state. I'm not saying that to criticize the police. I'm just saying these things happen. Now, the police light you up for a speeding infraction, or they look up your license plate and they see that your car isn't currently registered, or you don't have insurance or something like that. So they pull you over to write you a ticket, which is going to be probably a civil infraction, at the worst a misdemeanor. But you turn it into felony fleeing and evading by running from them. What sense is there in that? And you watch these videos and you'll hear the police ask them, what were you thinking? Well, I have news for the police. They weren't. If they see the police and they have a guilty conscience because they know they've done something wrong, and they begin to fear, the fear reaction is going to trigger the fight, flight, freeze reaction, whichever one is the one that their experience has led them to adopt. And evolution has developed such that it's going to shut down the rational brain, because the rational brain takes too long to think to get you out of an immediate threat. So it gets shut down. They're no longer thinking, they're just reacting. And the idea that, hey, if I do this, instead of facing a civil infraction or misdemeanor, I'm going to be facing felony charges, it doesn't register in their brains, because right now that part of their brains is shut down. And I think that may be happening with Pharaoh here. He's lost his son. His country is in total disarray through all these plagues and all these things that have happened. And now he's lost his source of free labor. His limbic brain is taken over. His rational mind is no longer active. And seeing this unusual event of a path opening through the sea, he doesn't think, what's going to happen to me if I go in there? He just goes in there. So when God's people get out and God undoes whatever it was he did that made that path through the sea, not through God's intent, but through Pharaoh's own choices, he and his entire army are there in harm's way, and they're destroyed by the waters. Not that that's what God intended, but that that's what they chose by being ridiculous. But the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground as the water stood up like a wall on both sides. That is how the Lord rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians that day. And the Israelites saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the seashore. When the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Next chapter. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord. This is in Hebrew poetry. It's likely that Moses himself prepared these words and taught them to the people as a way of celebrating, of commemorating the act of deliverance that they had just experienced. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both horse and rider into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has given me victory. Now, if you are familiar with other elements of Hebrew poetry, you may recognize some of these poetic structures here and some of these wordings. And I'm turning to a passage in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 12. It's the chapter in Isaiah that doesn't sound like the prophet. It sounds like one of the Psalms. Well, because that's what it is. So of course it sounds like one of that Psalms. Yes, in that day you will say, I will praise you, O Lord. Although you were angry with me, your anger is turned away, and you have comforted me. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. And let me get that. Hello. Whoops. There. Hello. You must have fallen asleep because your phone hung up on me.
No. I needed a nurse.
Do you still need one?
I've done what I could to deal with the problem, but you can fix it later. The thing on my neck.
Oh, yeah.
Exposed and hurting.
All right. We can deal with that. So, this phrase, the Lord is my strength and my song, can be found in a number of places in the Old Testament. So it's a familiar Hebrew poetic phrase. And this may be its origin, that whenever it is used elsewhere in the Psalms and in the writings of the prophets, it is, in a sense, referencing this poem and this event. Do you know where we are?
No.
Well, we just started chapter 15, and we're reading the song of Moses and the people of Israel.
Okay.
And it starts out, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both horse and rider into the sea. And then verse 2, the Lord is my strength and my song. He has given me victory. And I was just noting that there are a number of places in the Psalms and in other places in the Old Testament where that phrase, my strength and my song, is used. And we might actually see all those occurrences as references to this song and to this event in Israelite history. This is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Footnote A there. Yahweh is a transliteration of the proper name, YHWH, the four consonants of the Tetragrammaton, that is sometimes rendered Jehovah. In this translation, it is usually rendered the Lord. Note the use of small capitals. But in this case, they chose to actually give this transliteration Yahweh in this instance. Pharaoh's chariots and army he has hurled into the sea. The finest of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. Footnote B probably is going to say, or the Sea of Reeds, yeah, also in 1522, so we'll run across that again. The deep waters gushed over them, they sank to the bottom like a stone. Well, they were probably wearing metal armor, so that's not very conducive to flotation.
Neither are axe heads.
Hmm?
Neither are axe heads.
Right. But what I'm saying is there are a lot of elements here in which what happened to the Egyptians is just the natural result of the choices Pharaoh made. Getting bogged down in the land at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
That's not hard to understand. You don't have to imagine any miracles taking place for that to be happening. And when this force that had provided a path through the sea is removed, it doesn't take any destructive power. Nature simply takes its course. The water closes in, and anybody who was dumb enough to be in that situation in metal armor, probably, going to have a hard time swimming. I'm just saying, you know.
You know, it always fascinated me how the water parted.
And that explanation.
Once upon a time, several years ago, I saw a video. Somebody had gone out to the lake, and while he was there, a whirlpool appeared in the middle of the lake, and the lake just started draining, and he captured it on video and posted it on the internet. And I sat there and I watched, and the lake actually drained through this sinkhole that appeared.
Yeah.
And, you know, natural cause could be that a sinkhole appeared there in the Red Sea and exposed dry land, and then water came back and covered it over.
Yeah, we don't know. The explanation given by the writer here that the east wind blew and caused this to happen. Wind might have been one of the agents in making this happen, but if it was purely wind, it would have been very hard for people to walk through without getting blown around. So it was whatever the author understood or believed. That's what they wrote down. So
Yeah, and the author may not have been that informed on the sciences.
probably not. Reading on, verse 6. Your right hand, O Lord, is glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, smashes the enemy. Well, we don't believe God smashes other humans. However, if our enemy is our own faults and failings, might we be able to say that the Lord, Yahweh, smashes that enemy if we give him permission to be active in our lives? In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow those who rise against you. You unleash your blazing fury. It consumes them like straw. At the blast of your breath, the waters piled up. The surging water stood straight like a wall. In the heart of the sea, the deep waters became hard. The enemy boasted, I will chase them and catch up with them. I will plunder them and consume them. I will flash my sword. My powerful hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Glorious in holiness, awesome in splendor, performing great wonders. You raised your right hand, and the earth swallowed our enemies. Again, this is the Hebrew viewpoint being seen here. With your unfailing love, you lead the people you have redeemed. In your might, you guide them to your sacred home. The peoples hear and tremble. Anguish grips those who live in Philistia. The leaders of Edom are terrified. The nobles of Moab tremble. All who live in Canaan melt away. Terror and dread fall upon them. The power of your arm makes them lifeless as stone, until your people pass by, O Lord, until the people you purchased pass by. You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, reserved for your own dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, that your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. And then verse 19, when Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and charioteers rushed into the sea, the Lord brought the water crashing down on them, but the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, also Moses' sister, obviously, took a tambourine and led all the women as they played their tambourines and danced. Now, this is the second appearance of Miriam. Wasn't Miriam mentioned by name earlier in the story of the
basket?
basket? Yeah. Okay, we say it's Miriam. It doesn't use the name Miriam in the narrative there. It just says his sister. And we believe it is probably Miriam because that's the sister that gets mentioned later.
He could have had more than one.
Well, yeah, he certainly could have. Maybe one even older than Miriam. We don't know. But I think that's how the story is usually told children, that it was Miriam. We used the name Miriam in telling about the girl who watched over the basket until the princess of Egypt took it out of the water. And Miriam sang this song: Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both horse and rider into the sea. So Moses prepared this far more lengthy poem here. And then Miriam took a portion of it and led the women in repeating this over and over, again in celebration of their deliverance from what had seemed like certain doom. Then Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled in this desert for 3 days without finding any water. When they came to the oasis of Marah, the water was too bitter to drink, so they called the place Marah, which means bitter. Wasn't that name again used in the book of Ruth?
But my life is not Esther, Ruth's mother-in-law.
Right. Yeah. Ruth 1, verse 20. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara. It's not spelled the same. It's just M-A-R-A instead of M-A-R-A-H. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. So that name appears in both those places, and it means bitter. Then the people complained and turned against Moses. What are we going to drink? They demanded. So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good drink. And I want to read that in a couple of other versions here, just because okay, the NIV calls it a piece of wood. Let's see what the King James calls it. Looks like I'm a couple of chapters off here in my King James. So we're near the end of chapter 15 here. And I need to separate that page so I can find the page I want. Okay, in the King James, verse 25, it says, And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which, when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. And then it goes on to say, There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. Now, we haven't read that part yet out of this version. It says, It was there at Marah that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. He said, If you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands and keeping all his decrees, then I will not make you suffer any of the diseases I sent on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. And here's a place where we begin to see the true character of God revealed even here in the Old Testament. I am the Lord who heals you. In our sinful condition, it's a spiritual sickness. It's a disease. It's not a case of bad behavior or bad people. It's a disease, and we need healing. And we need God, because God is the one who heals. Now, he did, in this case, make that conditional. It is conditional in our day. It is conditional on our consent. God grants us liberty and freedom. So he does not do for us something that we do not consent to have done for us. That's the condition. Now, in this case, the condition as stated in what is written is that you have to listen carefully to his voice and obey his commands, keep all his decrees. You gotta obey the rules, and then God will do good things for you. And I have suggested that this is part of the demonstration that God is making. He's going to give them rules, and he's going to demonstrate for the universe how rules don't work. So, towards that end, then, he says, keep all my degrees, I'll keep you healthy. After leaving Marah, the Israelites traveled on to the oasis of Elim, where they found 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They camped there beside the water. Now, I remember when I was a kid, somebody had traveled across the Atlantic and had come back with pictures from that part of the world. And one of the pictures that they had was the picture of a palm tree felled into a pool of water. And we were told that that was the tree that Moses had felled into the waters of Marah to make the water sweet. Well, these modern versions suggest that the better reading is he showed Moses some wood, a piece of wood, and he put the wood in the water. Well, a tree.
Would have been dead and rotted out so long ago it wouldn't be there anymore.
Well, that's what I figured. Yeah. Although I was so young back then that I'm like, now, wait a minute, all this stuff happened in heaven. How did he get there to get a picture of it? That's how young and naive I was when I saw that picture. Anyway. And we have a little time here. I think we'll go on to the next chapter. And this is about the manna and quail from heaven. And maybe when we get done, I'll have a time to discuss something unusual that I read about this. Then the whole community of Israel set out from Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin. Footnote A says the geographical name Sin is related to Sinai and should not be confused with the English word sin. Okay. Although, when I was doing that search, you'll see there is a Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. I didn't click it and look, follow it, but it did come up there as a search option. So apparently there's a Mount Sinai in Arabia as well as on what we call the Sinai Peninsula today. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. There, too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. And we are going to run across occasion after occasion after occasion where the Israelite people complain, and they direct their complaints against Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. Complain, complain, complain. Human nature. Don't take responsibility for yourself. Blame it on somebody else. And the easiest place to blame.
Anything wrong?
The easiest place to blame is the leadership. So Moses, the leader, will blame him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Look,
What do you mean? It was that woman you gave me.
yeah." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they will gather food, and when they prepare it, there will be twice as much as usual." So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "By evening you will realize it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Don't say we did it. The Lord did it. "In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he's heard your complaints, which are against him, not against us. What have we done that you should complain about us?" Then Moses added, "The Lord will give you meat to eat in the morning and bread to satisfy you in the evening, for he has heard all your complaints against him." What have we done? Yes, your complaints are against the Lord, not against us. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Announce this to the entire community of Israel. Present yourselves before the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke to the whole community of Israel, they looked out toward the wilderness. There they could see the awesome glory of the Lord in the cloud. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening, vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp. And the next morning, the area around the camp was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. "What is it?" they asked each other. They had no idea what it was. And Moses told them, "It is the food the Lord has given you to eat. These are the Lord's instructions. Each household should gather as much as it needs. Pick up 2 quarts for each person in your tent." Footnote C, Hebrew 1 omer, or about 2.2 liters, and also in these other cases. So here it's saying 2 quarts. Trying to adjust for what they think the ancient measures meant. So the people of Israel did as they were told. Some gathered a lot, some only a little. But when they measured it out, everyone had just enough. Measured it out, footnote D, measured it with an omer. An omer might have been a container. So when they measured with it, everybody had the right amount, regardless of how much they'd actually gathered. Those who had gathered a lot had nothing left over, and those who gathered only a little had enough. Each family had just what it needed. Then Moses told them, "Do not keep any of it until morning." But some of them didn't listen and kept some of it until morning. But by then it was full of maggots and had a terrible smell. Moses was very angry with them. So whatever this was, it went bad in a hurry. Just one day. After this, the people gathered the food morning by morning, each family according to its need. And as the sun became hot, the flakes they had not picked up melted and disappeared. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much as usual, 4 quarts for each person instead of 2. Then all the leaders of the community came and asked Moses for an explanation. He told them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow will be a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath day set apart for the Lord. So bake or boil as much as you want today and set aside what is left for tomorrow. So they put some aside until morning, just as Moses had commanded. And in the morning the leftover food was wholesome and good, without maggots or odor. Moses said, "Eat this food today, for today is a Sabbath day dedicated to the Lord. There will be no food on the ground today. You may gather food for 6 days, but the seventh day is the Sabbath. There will be no food on the ground that day." Some of the people went out anyway on the seventh day, but they found no food. The Lord asked Moses, "How long will these people refuse to obey my commands and instructions?" They must realize that the Sabbath is the Lord's gift to you. That is why he gives you a 2-day supply on the 6th day, so there will be enough for 2 days. On the Sabbath day you must each stay in your place. Do not go out to pick up food on the 7th day. So the people did not gather any food on the 7th day. The Israelites called the food manna. Manna means, what is it? It was white like coriander seed, and it tasted like honey wafers, suggesting that it was somewhat sweet, perhaps. Then Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Fill a 2-quart container with manna to preserve it for your descendants. Then later generations will be able to see the food I gave you in the wilderness when I set you free from Egypt." Now, we've talked about the metaphors here. The first metaphor was, of course, the metaphor of liberation. Now we have another metaphor, the metaphor of sustenance. God provided this wafer-like frosty substance that appeared on the ground each morning except on the 7th. And he had them preserve it so that there would be a remembrance of this metaphor as well, the metaphor of sustenance. In our spiritual experience, God gets us started with an experience of deliverance from the worst of our bondage to sin. Now, that experience of deliverance is going to continue as long as we're still on this earth. But we begin our spiritual experience with a liberating experience. And that might be a liberation from the rule-bound approach to living that most of this world dwells by. But then there is the sustenance. We need in our physical bodies regular sustenance in order to live. So in our spiritual experience, we need regular spiritual sustenance, regular spiritual food, refreshing understandings of the character of God to keep us going, or spiritual life will cease. Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded Moses. He eventually placed it in the Ark of the Covenant in front of the stone tablets inscribed with the terms of the covenant. Or he placed it in front of the testimony. See the note on chapter 25, verse 16, which we'll get to later. So the people of Israel ate manna for 40 years until they arrived at the land where they would settle. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. The container used to measure the manna was an omer, which was 1/10 of an ephah. It held about 2 quarts, or an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. Well, that's what it just said. I don't know why they didn't tell us that in the footnote. And I think we've reached a point that's a good stopping point. Now, maybe next week we'll talk more about the quail and the manna here. I have read interpretations in which the quail was a repeated event. Now, it says here very specifically that the manna was repeated for 40 years. It only talks about the quail twice, once here, and then there'll be another event later in which we'll run across the quail. So their interpretation was the quail was an everyday event, but it doesn't say that. So I won't say it didn't happen every day, but I rather doubt it. Simply because of what we'll read later involving the quail. So, they were suggesting that this manna was not complete nutrition, and they needed the protein, and so God provided them with quail every night. Every night they knocked down quail, every morning they got the manna. But again, the text doesn't say the quail was every night, it just said it was that one night. And then the other night that we haven't read about yet that we'll get to. And we might also at some point talk a little bit about this whole Sabbath thing and the multiple miracles involved in there not being manna on the ground every seventh day. But looking for another. Anything you had to think of that we ought to mention before we go? Or are you even there? She might have gone to sleep again. I don't know. Well, I'm looking at my clock and it says we've used up our time and we have reached the end of a chapter. So I will say that until next week, when we hope to see you again. By the way, next week we do expect to have a sermon presentation for next week, not tomorrow, but for next week. I think I already know about what we're going to cover, but you'll know that for sure next week when we do our sermon presentation. But until next Friday night, we invite you to join us then, and until then we say goodbye and God bless.